So I think it's convenient because I'm not sure if other people connected to change in English. Okay. Okay. So just a few words as a you know, probably you know about the session. We have 15-20 minutes for each speaker. Overall, the session basically is planned for 1 hour and 30 minutes. So what I would like to suggest, considering that this conference is in webinar, I would recommend to maintain the time within the limit of 15 and 20 minutes. So let's start with the first discussion. The argument is how far we are from price convergence in the EU energy market, a two-step procedure to define a composite index of electricity and natural gas price. So the speaker is Consuelo Rubina Nava, which is a researcher of the University of Udine. Very few words regarding the experience in historical price. Okay, so just okay. I see that Bal is connected. So good morning, Bal.
Hello. Good morning. Hello there.
Good morning, Chris. Good morning. Sorry, because we started. If this is no problem, we are starting with Consuelo. And
that's
then
fine. Yes,
okay,
that's fine.
move, and then we will move it to you.
Thank you.
Okay. So basically, what we are saying is that Consuelo will present this argument again, how far we are from price convergence in the EU energy market, a two-step procedure to define a composite index of electricity and natural gas price. So the experience which Consuelo has in this sector, in historical price index, modeling of choice and economic decision makers, construction of stationary and non-stationary process, and construction of parametrics and parametrics by Bayesian method and models with the latent variables. I think that Consuelo will be better to define this argument. The overview very quickly is in the European Union, one of the 5 dimensions of an energy union strategy is to build a fully integrated internal energy markets, enabling the free flow of energy through the design of common energy market rules and the construction of cross-border infrastructure. So I think I will leave to present and to enter this argument to Consuelo. Okay.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I will present today this contribution, which is a joint work, preliminary joint work with Ernesto Cassetta and Maria Grazia Zoia. And the idea of how far we are from a price convergence in the EU energy markets is just our main research question, which drive the methodological proposal of our contribution. Try to, okay. So before going inside the details of our methodological proposal, I just want to briefly define the state of art. And in particular, one of the 5 pillars of the energy union strategies, as you remember before, is really the construction of a fully integrated energy market, enabling the free flow of energy across the EU countries, and in particular without technical or regulatory barriers. This means that formally we are expecting that the energy can be produced in one country and then delivered to industrial or, for instance, domestic consumers in another one. So the idea is that through this fully integrated energy market, we are expecting that there is a force down in the prices and in particular a form of their convergence, also following Cifarelli et al. 2020. So if we move on a more policy perspective, what we are interested to is to evaluate the price changes and the price dispersion. And for instance, following the fifth report on the state of the energy union, what we are observing is an important improvement in the last years of the design of the energy market and cross-border exchanges, especially inducing a reduction into the electricity prices. The point is that principally we are observing a change, and in particular price convergence, more in the industrial, regarding more the industrial consumption than not the household or domestic consumers. In particular, the main literature, scientific literature on this topic principally refer to the electricity market, and in particular is principally focused on single market, or at least few EU markets, showing, at least to the best of our knowledge, some mixed results in the European panorama. Of course, what we are expecting, also following Bastianini et al. 2019, is a form of progressive unification of the price in the energy market, both for the electricity and the natural gas prices. However, what we are observing are, especially in the electricity market, some mixed results on the one side, and on the other side, on the gas market, in reality, there are just a few contributions, studying the price convergence in Europe at least, and they are effectively highlighting a form of convergence, however, still studying only the industrial consumers. So our idea of our contribution is to try to pick all these elements together, and in particular to simultaneously evaluate the price in the for natural gas prices and electricity prices, both for industrial and domestic consumers. To this aim, what we are going to propose is a, let's say, two, or maybe in a better way, three-step procedure, which is characterized by the use of a price index. It's called the country product dummy index. Is widely known because it refers to the so-called stochastic approach. It's a price index that principally associated to the possibility to interpret it as the result of the estimation in a regression model format. Then I will give you some small insight in a few seconds. And it is widely used, especially by the International Comparison Program at the World Bank. So it could be considered, let's say, a good standard for the computation, for mixing together the prices of different countries and across time, according to these four dimensions, so natural gas and electricity, both for households and non-household consumers. So through this country product dummy index, as represented here, what we want to do is to compute the country product dummy index for each year across the different country. And therefore, what we have is, let's say, a matrix of data of price index, or to be more precise, of purchase power parity of the different EU countries over different years. Now we will then define the details. And then the second step is a clusterization process. A simple hierarchical cluster analysis based on the VAR method on the Euclidean distance allows us to cluster different countries. And then across the clusterization of this country, we try to investigate the trend, estimating the trend itself of the purchase power parity through the so-called Audrey-Prescott filter, the HP filter, still, for instance, used by Bastianini et al. 2019. And then, in such a way, we try to define to identify if there is or not a form of price convergence, and if it is characterized as some specific market, or in reality it is something quite diffused. So just a few details about the country product dummy index. Let's think about considering PIJ, the real price of the heat commodity in the jade country. In this case, the commodity are principally the price associated to natural gas and electricity for households and non-household consumers. And then let's consider the purchase power parity, which is just the currency of the currency of country J with respect to the reference country, let's call it M. Now, the idea of the country product dummy model in its additive form is just the following. Let's consider the logarithms of Pij to be just the sum of a first effect, which is just the average price of the heat commodity in the observed markets, plus the logarithms of the purchase power parity of country J, plus an error term. So in reality, this can be rewritten considering just an effect that should be estimated, which is eta I and plus pi j, which is the most interesting things because it's allow me to estimate the purchase power parity plus an error term. And then in reality, you can consider it this effect, let's say eta I and pi j, simply as the effect of a dummy variable, which in the first case for eta I simply represent is equal to 1 if we are dealing with the commodity I, and 0 otherwise, while for instance for the second dummy we have a value equal to 1 if the country is the country J and otherwise is equal to 0. So just without entering too much inside the details, but however, taking simply an advantage of the ordinal least square, we can estimate pi j simply in the following way represented here, and then computing the exp of pi j, we obtain simply an estimate of the purchase power parity, which is the object that we want to deal with. So this is the first step. The second one is the clusterization. The third one is the evaluation of the trend, the estimation of the trend of this time series of the purchase power parity for each different country through the Audrey-Prescott filter. Now just move immediately on the results. So we estimate the purchase power parity for each country for each year, and considering the following data. We take advantage of the data present on the official Eurostat statistics website. So this example is really you can easily replicate it with the same data, and we consider the average national prices without taxes paid for electricity and natural gas, as I anticipated to you, for industrial and domestic consumers. Details are simply here just to identify the fact that we are considering, for instance, for the industrial consumers, the medium-sized one. The period that spanned from 2008 and 2018, so we have observation of these prices for each year, and we have therefore a 44 observation for each country, because we have 4 different goods, the natural and electricity gas for industrial and domestic consumers. We consider, as for every price index, a base country. The base country in this case, given that we want to evaluate the status at European level, is just the average prices in the EU 28, and just pay attention on the fact that due to an excessive lack of information on the prices for Greece, Malta, and the Republic of Cyprus, we need to exclude them. So we still deal only with 25 European countries, considering still the UK, given that in that period it was still in the European Union. So let's now move on the results. From this first step, so the first step allow me to estimate the purchase power parity, and then what I'm going to do, taking advantage of the hierarchical clustering from a hierarchical cluster analysis, is just to cluster countries over time in 4 different clusters. The first cluster, which is you can see it from the heat map, or if you prefer, from the the map is characterized by the fact it has a low priced, so at least a low purchase power parity with respect to the average, or at least with respect to the base here, the base country, so the average in the European Union. The second cluster is characterized by a low average prices, so we are more close to the average, but however we approach it from below. And while, for instance, the third cluster is a high average price market because it approaches the average from above. And then finally, we have the fourth cluster in which, for instance, Italy, Spain, Portugal are included, which is the high priced one, or at least the one which is characterized by high purchase power parity. So accordingly to this, what we do is just try to analyze, taking advantage of the Audrey-Prescott filter, of the trend for each different country of the purchase power parity computed across the different countries. Here you can just visualize with the same colors as before, the different cluster. And in particular, what we can notice is that from the simple time series of the purchase power parity, we notice a form of convergence, apparent convergence for the first, second, and third cluster, while, for instance, the trend seems to be quite different for the fourth one. And entering more in the detail, in particular estimating the trend component of the purchase power parity, taking advantage of the Audrey-Prescott filter with smoothing parameters equal to 100, following the literature, for instance, the one-sided year, or also to be more related to the energy sector, to Bastiani et al. 2019, what we retain is that, what we can observe is that effectively it seems that the trend show a convergence in the purchase power parity, both for cluster 3, cluster 2, and cluster 1. However, the cluster 2 seems to have a more different behavior across the different countries which belongs to this cluster. So maybe further evaluation should be done on this cluster to evaluate if it could be suitable to split it once in two groups or not. This is a further step. At the same time, to see if in reality, just looking at the prices instead of looking at the purchase power parity, we compare the electricity for household and non-household consumers prices, taking advantage of the same procedure. So I look on the left to the price series as it is, and on the other side just consider the trend estimated via the Audrey-Prescott filter. Once again, this is something which appears also from the literature, that the electricity trend for non-household consumers seems to be more concentrated than not the one associated to the household one. At the same time, we go through the same consideration also for the prices associated to the natural gas. However, considering a trend which seems to be a little bit decreasing in the last year, and more concentrated than not the trend for the electricity prices in non-household consumers that we see before. So this is just the insights over this preliminary work that I'm going to do with my colleague. Just to conclude, the idea could be that we have to apply further instrument to evaluate the convergence of the prices and of the purchase power parity. We need maybe the possibility, we can improve our analysis maybe using further type of price index, still maybe belonging on the framework of the stochastic approach, and maybe more recent contributions. And finally, we can try to change the data and going maybe a little bit further, instead of using the price of the final consumer, maybe further type of information that are available for this evaluation. So thank you so much. I hope to, if you have some questions, it will be a pleasure to respond to you.
Sei silenziato, Luigi.
Okay, sorry guys. No, thanks Consuelo, because you are in perfect time. Okay, so considering that probably we can also use a little more time, but in any case, any question, you can use the system, and we will address to Consuelo, of course. So, okay, thanks again, Consuelo. I think that we can move. Okay, here we are. Perfect. We can move ahead with Chris, which the arguments that we'll present is assessing stakeholders' acceptance of energy transformation pathways, the case of Germany net zero strategy. Chris,
I'm sorry, I think you've frozen.
Sorry? Can you hear me, Chris?
I'm sorry, you froze there, but I presume it was just introducing the. Yes, I seem to be. Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Yeah. Now, yes.
So sorry, the system froze there just for a moment. Sorry about that. Yep. Okay. So I'll just share my screen.
Yeah. Okay. So just let me finish a few seconds, Chris. I'm just as introducing your experience. Okay, so we saw now your screen. Chris has a strong experience in evaluation of energy system and transformation pathways and the use of multi-criteria decision analysis, economic assessment of energy technologies, and innovation diffusion of technologies. So as a overview, Chris is presenting the project's main goal, which is to understand to what extent different stakeholders support or reject energy transformation pathways that could help achieve Germany's net zero strategy. So I leave to present to Chris 15-20 minutes as usual. So you can start, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's great to kind of be here again, albeit online, but I'm going to be presenting essentially some work that was done by a master's student of ours, Vishnu Teja, who unfortunately could not attend this conference. And he did some work with us on the HiCam project, and I'm going to be presenting some of the main findings from his dissertation. So it's looking at the ancillary costs and benefits of the transformation of the German energy system. And this is part of the HiCam project, which is a 2-year project run by the Helmholtz Association, which is one of the major German research groups. And in the Research Centre Jülich, we're part of the Helmholtz Association. I want to explain to you what the HiCam project is, first of all. It stands for Helmholtz Initiative Climate Adaptation and Mitigation, HiCam. And essentially, it is interested in how Germany will achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And there are 3 parts to it. There's the mitigation part, which is how, of course, how to reduce the emissions. There's the adaptation part, which is how to adapt to the effects of climate change in Germany. And also there's a 3rd part, which is very focused on communicating the findings to policymakers and decision makers. The Helmholtz Association wanted this to be something that was very close to practice and very usable for policymakers. I should say something, and I'm sure you're all familiar, of course, with net zero, but it's about emissions reductions and also about the use of negative emissions technologies, because emissions reductions on their own, it became clear, would not be enough to meet the goals. And these negative emissions technologies have to be used to remove any residual emissions that may remain from processes that are very difficult to decarbonize, perhaps some industrial processes, for example. So what Vishnu did is he has essentially looked we are interested in the mitigation part, the emissions reductions. So what he has done over the summer is look at different transformation pathways for Germany to meet those net zero emissions in different sectors, the power sector, the heating sector, the transport sector and industry. And he's looked at what are the stakeholder preferences in relation to these pathways, which transformation pathway in each sector does each particular stakeholder prefer? And in this presentation, we're going to be looking at the power sector. So there are 7 scenarios that we looked at. Now, those are at the bottom of the screen. And if we want to group the scenarios, you have there you have scenarios that are about a much more gradual transition based on fuel switching from coal to gas. That's this ST scenario, the sustainable transition scenario. Centralized top-down transformation. You then have a much more decentralized scenario, the DG, distributed generation scenario, which is much more focused on households, prosumers, decentralized PV technologies. So you've got 2 very different visions there. And then you have also other scenarios that are focused on particular technologies, in which particular technologies play an important role in the transformation. So you've got W, which is wind power, BM, which is biomass, and also H, which is a scenario in which hydrogen technologies play a particularly key role. And in terms of the power sector, what we've done is for each decade, 2020, 2030, 2040, we've looked at what the reactions, what the preferences for the stakeholders are in relation, which of these scenarios do they prefer in each particular decade, looking at government, industry, utilities and households. Those are the 4 key stakeholders that have been the focus of the project. In terms of the theory, obviously the transformation pathways, the net zero strategy, it has a public benefit. It has public good benefits, namely the climate protection. However, that's not the whole story. Each transformation pathway also has very different what we call ancillary benefits. Now, these are private benefits that accrue to particular stakeholders, and that are realized in a shorter time frame than the major public benefit. It could be things like reductions in local air pollution. If we take a country engaging in a net zero strategy, the private ancillary benefits could be things like reductions in local air pollution, reduced import dependency because they don't have to import so much in terms of fossil fuels, employment effects that may come from the introduction of new technologies. In addition to ancillary benefits, there are also ancillary costs that are private as well for particular stakeholders that involve investment, loss of profitability, effects on profitability, these sorts of issues. And the argument is that these private ancillary effects are actually much more important in determining whether a stakeholder supports a particular transformation pathway than the public benefit. In terms of our methodological approach, we use multi-criteria decision analysis, which is essentially a structure for categorizing a transformation pathway's benefits and drawbacks. And also it's a method for categorizing the priorities of each particular stakeholder. Now, we have used Prometee, which is a variant of multi-criteria decision analysis. and it's commonly used in areas of environmental management and to deal with energy questions or energy decisions in the energy system. And essentially, what it does is you could have two alternatives, A and B, for example, just to give you, to indicate how it works. So you've got transformation pathway A, transformation pathway B. On a set of criteria, the transformation pathway A does particularly well. It does better than transformation pathway B, so it has a high entering flow on those criteria. Whereas on a certain set of criteria, transformation pathway A does worse than transformation pathway B, so it has a higher leaving flow on those criteria. And essentially, if criteria A has a higher entering flow and a lower leaving flow than criteria B, than the transformation pathway B on a set of criteria, it performs better. It is preferred for a particular stakeholder. So that's just a basic overview of how MCDA works. You've got your performance criteria for the pathways, you've got your priorities of your stakeholders, and you essentially calculate the performance of the desirability of the particular alternative based on those. Now let's go into some of the findings for the stakeholders. We collected the data, did some theorizing about the priorities of the stakeholders, and then we did some calculations and came up with the preferences for the stakeholders in the power sector in relation to the different transformation pathways. Now, if we start with the government in all decades, 2020, 2030, 2040, prefers this decentralized distributed generation scenario. Now, from the government's perspective, the DG scenario has a lot of renewable energy generation, so there are climate benefits, but also there are other social benefits involving employment and also lower import dependency. Those are the ancillary benefits that lead the government to prefer the distributed generation scenario. There are also lower financial and technology risks in this particular scenario, dealing with a fairly mature technology, PV generation. There's also less of a need for, there isn't CCS in this scenario, so there's a lower risks associated with that, less of a need to build the associated infrastructure. For the industry, their concerns, their preferences are driven by the unit cost of electricity for competitiveness reasons, and also by the presence of coal and natural gas in a particular scenario. For the industry, they have a high dependency on fossil fuels, especially, for example, the steel industry, which perhaps still uses furnaces. So they have adaptation difficulties. So they prefer a more gradual transition or scenarios in which coal and natural gas are going to be retained for a longer period of time. So they, without CCS, in the variants without CCS, they prefer the hydrogen scenario initially, then they move to wind in 2030. But as they begin to adapt to non-fossil, as they begin to move away to fossil fuels, by 2040, the industry starts to prefer the DG scenario, because they've weakened that dependence on fossil fuels. They've adapted over the decades to different technologies, so their preferences move towards this more ambitious distributed generation scenario in 2040, which has a lower cost of electricity. The utilities, their concerns are going to be driven, of course, by their profitability and also by the investment costs involved in the particular scenarios in each decade. And they, of course, prefer this sustainable transition scenario in all decades, okay? Because it allows them to keep as much of their existing infrastructure as possible, and also means that their role is retained to a far greater extent. So the utilities are likely to resist a more ambitious transformation scenario, such as that involved with the DG scenario, for example. With households, again, their preferences are driven by the unit cost of electricity, but they also have some concerns about employment, income, and the environment as well. And what is quite interesting here is that there is a disparity between low-income households and high-income households. So the low-income households, they start with a sustainable transition and move to the distributed generation scenario in the decades of 2030 and 2040. But the higher income households that place a greater priority on decarbonisation want to go to even more ambitious scenarios, the biomass scenario in 2030 and 2040. These higher income households are willing to pay, they have a willingness to pay a little more for their electricity to achieve the more ambitious decarbonisation effects, essentially. So in terms of the conclusions, we find actually that most of the stakeholders are quite willing to go for quite an ambitious transformation scenario for the power sector. That said, there are still some resistance, especially from the utilities, from actors, from stakeholders that have difficulty in adapting to a more ambitious transformation scenario. And there are also some frictions at the other end. You've got households in certain states, in sort of wealthier households in certain German states, who actually want to go further than want to go to a more ambitious scenario. So you've got these tensions there. And an interesting conclusion is that even with the benefits from CCS, the transformation pathways, which include carbon capture and storage, do not perform well. The risks associated appear to be too high for most of the stakeholders. So that is an interesting finding, and we have to consider that if the German government is going to choose a scenario which involves the use of CCS in some form. This is quite an interesting problem. So that's really all of the this is really what I wanted to present you this morning. Thanks a lot for your attention. Thank you.
Okay, very well. Thanks, Chris, for this presentation. Also, so I think we are in perfect time. So I think we can move with Paolo, and next, not sure for the last part of the presentation. So we will be back to you, Chris, if the case.
Sure.
But in any case, just a few words for the next argument. Paolo will present the emergency measure to protect energy consumer during the COVID-19 pandemic, a focus on the Italian intervention. With this Paolo experience are focused on as environmental engineering, specialized in energy and sustainability, an extensive experience on research and consultancy of energy policy and economics, and with a focus on market and tariff design, energy poverty and distribution and impact of the energy transition. So the overview is the COVID-19 outbreak that spread worldwide in the first month of 2020 has obliged many governments to undertake confinement measures. So I will leave it to Paolo to present these topics. So Paolo, please, can you start?
Yeah, thank you, Luigi, for your presentation. I work at Comillas University in Madrid, and I developed this piece of research together with Paolo Rodilla from the same institution and Carlos Bagge from the MIT. As you said, the focus of this presentation is the interventions that many governments apply to protect consumers during the COVID-19 and the consequent lockdown. So, just as an introduction, can you see the presentation properly? I see it a little cat, but
yes,
I will,
yes, very well.
I will go on. So, Of course, the pandemic had a very strong impact on the energy sector in terms of energy prices, oil, CO2 emission trading, and other issues. But the main effect was probably on the electricity demand. So the overall effect on electricity demand was a net reduction, a strong net reduction that we can observe in this chart from the International Energy Agency. For a selection of countries, we can see that the reduction in electricity demand during the first lockdown, the spring lockdown, was achieving also 30% exactly for Italy. So a very strong reduction in the demand for electricity. But that's the total demand. The story is different if we focus on residential demand, domestic demand. Because of course lockdown and confinement measures forced people to stay home and increased the electricity demand of households. This example is for Spain. We take this is regulated demand, regulated residential demand. We took 2 days, one in 2019 and the other one during the pandemic, with the same temperature pattern, more or less. And we can see that the profile of demand is changed, but especially we can appreciate a net increase of electricity demand. The same effect could be observed all over the world in jurisdictions affected by the COVID-19. Here, this chart is for Australia. We can see in purple the total demand, total electricity demand, and its reduction. But in yellow, we can see once again residential demand, and we can see how it changed. And so with a net increase in residential demand. So this increase in domestic demand, of course, coincided in time with an unprecedented destruction of employment in many countries. This is a very significant chart from the United States, where from 1 month to the other, the unemployment rate switched from 4% to 15%. Okay, so a very strong destruction of works. And it was like that all over the world. This chart is for Italy, which is the focus of this analysis, and we can see how in the first part of the lockdown, at least 500,000 jobs were lost, and probably these measures are conservative according to experts. So the combination of these two effects, from on one side the increase in residential demand for electricity, and on the other hand this destruction of employment and these financial problems for households, of course exacerbated a strong and pre-existing problem of the energy sector, which is energy poverty. So people unable to cover their basic energy needs. This prompted several governments around the world to protect energy consumers with a great variety of measures. And the underlying assumption was, of course, that if the government required people to stay home, then the energy needs of these homes, of these households, should be satisfied. So in the springtime, we developed a global analysis of this intervention, of these emergency measures to protect energy consumers. And we also provide a classification of them. So what you can find if you look around the world, of course, you can find, first of all, disconnection bans. So you can't cut electricity during lockdowns. That was the first initial measures in many jurisdictions. Then you also have energy bills deferral, also called payment extension plans. So certain categories of consumers are allowed not to pay their bill during the lockdown, and they will pay them when the pandemic is over, with very different rules for that. And then the third measure that we identified was enhanced energy assistance programs. So, for example, jurisdictions with social tariffs, with energy checks for the energy poor. These scheme were somehow enhanced, widening, for example, the pool of beneficiaries. The fourth measure, which was much more widespread than expected, is energy bills reduction or even cancellation. And sometimes these measures were just for all. So the bill for several categories of consumers were totally canceled somehow to help them during the lockdown. Then some jurisdiction complemented these measures also with interventions focusing on commercial especially, but also somehow industrial users, small industrial users, reducing somehow the bills for these activities while they were probably closed due to the lockdown. Then the sixth and very important measure, it's the creation of financing mechanisms to fund all these the emergency measures that we mentioned up to now. So this was a global view, and then for this research, we try to apply this classification and to focus on the Italian experience to see which were the outcomes of this experience. The Italian experience is particularly interesting because it was probably the first Western country to suffer from the pandemic. So the Italian regulator was the first one who had to react to this situation in terms of energy consumption. And also because Italy underwent, especially in spring, one of the most restrictive lockdown in Western democracies, at least. And so it's a particularly interesting case study. So the measures implemented in Italy are mentioned here. The very first measure was, as you probably know, 11 municipalities in northern Italy were the initial focus of this pandemic, this epidemic at that time. In these 11 municipalities, the regulator decided to defer all energy bills and to recover these bills in a 6-month period after the lockdown. Then the second measure was a postponement of all the deadlines involved in social tariffs. As you may know, in Italy we have social tariffs for energy, and they have a renewal which is yearly. And so all the social tariffs with a deadline during the lockdown were automatically postponed, a measure that I believe it's still in place until that there will be an automatic renewal for this year. Then the third and very important measure when the epidemic affected the entire territory was a national disconnection ban for residential users. So it was impossible to cut electricity and also gas supply during the lockdown in Italy, a measure that which was followed by several jurisdictions later. Then Italy also introduced specific measures for small and medium enterprises, basically bill reductions through a reduction of the fixed component of the electricity tariff, for example. But then probably the most important part was the creation of a specific financing mechanism, which was this COVID account, a €1.5 billion fund to finance all these measures that we just mentioned and to guarantee the stability of retailing companies. So our analysis of these Italian interventions, we can see here the strengths of this intervention by the Italian regulator. Probably the one of the strengths of this strategy was the introduction of this disconnection ban, which was, as I mentioned, later introduced in almost all affected jurisdictions. So a disconnection ban, of course, it's a second best approach because it reaches everybody, not only who actually needs that measure. But it's quite important to have this kind of measure because, as you may remember, in spring during the first lockdown, the public administration was closed somehow. It was impossible for citizens to have a certificate to state anything at all. So it was important to have this bypass of all this bureaucratic paperwork, which was impossible to be done in spring. So that was probably a good intervention. And then the second strength of the Italian case is probably the creation of this specific fund. This was not something very common around the world. The United States, Brazil, there are several experiences of creation of this fund, but not all regulators introduce something like that. And we believe it's quite an important measure because, of course, during the lockdown, you really do not want to have financial problems in the retailing sectors. Because you want to protect your companies because they provide a basic and essential service to energy consumers and to citizens in general. So these were the two strengths of the Italian intervention: the initial disconnection ban, and then the creation of a specific fund. Coming to the weaknesses, probably the main weakness was the lack of any improvement in the energy assistance programs. This is something that was done in several jurisdictions, and as you, I mean, it's quite important also because energy assistance programs like social tariffs, for example, should be the best channel to provide this economic aid, because they already relied on some sort of socioeconomic targeting. So it was quite important to focus on them. Several jurisdictions around the world, for example, widened the pool of beneficiaries, including different categories, or directly increased the aid. Since the domestic electricity demand was increasing, they increased the aid. If the discount on tariff was maybe 25%, they brought it to 40, or if the energy check was $1,000, they brought it to $1,400 or something like that. Or a third way to enhance these programs was to soften eligibility criteria. For example, some regulators in the United States, they start considering only the last month to check the income to decide if a consumer was should be a beneficiary of these assistance programs. The advantage of improving these social tariff and assistance programs is that that would also represent somehow a solution for the aftermath of this crisis, because when the sanitary crisis will be over, we will still have an economic crisis which will stand longer, and energy poverty is definitely increased because of this of the situation. Then the second weakness, it's probably the lack of consideration of a proper targeting of the measures introduced in Italy, and that's common, probably a common weakness of, around the world. So Italy introduced bills deferral, introduced a disconnection ban. We do not have to forget that these measures represent an economic aid, because if the consumer is not paying the bill, someone has to cover that bill, and someone have to put money. There are interest rates involved. That's an economic aid, just like an energy check. And as all economic aids should be targeted, because otherwise it will reach people who are not in need for that economic aid. So it's true that, for example, the disconnection ban will not be checked, the necessity of this measure, but the regulators could have informed people that an ex post check was to be carried out. Or, for example, with the deferral of energy bills, the Italian regulator was forced to issue a press note specifying that this deferral didn't mean cancellation of bills, and ask for solidarity of energy consumers. So saying those who can pay, please pay the bills. But that's not the idea of regulation. You should not appeal to the solidarity of energy consumers. You should define properly your measures, and of course it was hard to find a way, but we found an example, for example, in Colombia, of the regulator provided a deferral for the electricity bills for the poorest layers of the population. So they were allowed not to pay the bill during the lockdown. But still, they introduced, for example, a 10% discount for those consumers who were actually paying, who actually kept on paying the bills on time. And that was an incentive. I think it's they used the carrot instead of the stick, but that's a nice idea, reflecting that they understood that they had to give incentives for people to keep on paying their bills. So strengths, the disconnection ban and the creation of the COVID account. And on the weakness side, probably the lack of improvement of the social tariff, the lack of widening of the pool of beneficiaries, and also the lack of targeting of some of these measures that could have probably waste some of the economic resources devoted to this goal. So that was basically all I wanted to say. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paolo, for this excellent presentation. And now we should have Immaculata, but I understood that probably she has not connected. So if you agree, so just a couple minutes or even less, because otherwise we can conclude our session. Just some time because let me check. Yes, apparently probably is not connecting. Okay. So I think that we can close this session here. I'm sorry for the last part, for the last presentation of Immaculata, which I understood that she had some problem this morning. Again, thanks to all for your presentation, for your explanation, and hoping that very soon we can solve this problem of the pandemic of COVID. So. Okay, so thanks again, and hoping to speak soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.